Lily had lived in her apartment for nearly a year before she noticed the shadow. It first appeared on a quiet late night when she was returning from work, tired and dragging her feet up the stairs. The building's dimly lit hallways were familiar. Old, creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a faint, musty smell that hung in the air. But something was different that night. As she reached the top of the staircase, she saw it, a shadow at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the shadow of a person passing by. It seemed darker, denser, almost separate from the dim lighting. It was just standing there still as if watching. Her pulse quickened, but she told herself it was nothing more than a trick of the light or her imagination. Over the next few nights, the shadow returned. Each time it was there, always at the far end of the hallway, just lingering, never moving toward her but never disappearing either. It became a routine. Lily would walk through the hallway, glance toward the end, and the shadow would be there, waiting. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was growing unbearable. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She stayed up late, watching the hallway through the peephole in her door. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Just as she was about to give up, she saw a movement. The shadow was back, but this time it was closer, creeping down the hallway toward her door. Her breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door, heart pounding, as the shadow slowly slid out of view. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching her directly this time, as though it knew she was looking. The next day, Lily began asking her neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. Most shrugged it off. Old buildings made strange noises and shadows played tricks, they said. But one elderly tenant, Mrs. Ward, gave her a grave look when Lily mentioned the shadow. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Mrs. Ward whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's been here for years. They say it belongs to a man who lived on the top floor long ago. He disappeared one night. No one ever found out what happened to him." Chilled by the story, Lily pressed for more details, but Mrs. Ward shook her head, unwilling to say anything further. Now, Lily couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. Was it really connected to a missing tenant? Could it be something more than just a figment of her imagination? That night, she left a small lamp on in the hallway, hoping the light would keep the shadow at bay. But when she checked through the peephole, she saw the shadow lurking in the same spot as always, unaffected by the light, still as dark and ominous as ever. Desperate for answers, Lily did some digging. She found old newspaper articles about the building, one of which mentioned a man named Thomas who had vanished decades ago. According to the article, he had been a reclusive tenant who often complained about strange happenings in the building. After his disappearance, there were reports of unexplained noises and sightings, but nothing concrete ever came of it. One evening, determined to confront the shadow, Lily stepped out into the hallway. The air felt colder and the silence was oppressive. The shadow was there, unmoving at the far end. She took a deep breath and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" To her shock, the shadow began to move, slowly, deliberately. It approached her not as a solid figure but as a creeping, shapeless darkness. Lily's heart raced as it neared, but just as it was about to reach her, it stopped. A cold whisper brushed against her ears. "Help me." Lily's breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was a plea, a desperate cry from the shadow. Realizing that this might be the spirit of the missing tenant, trapped in some unknown fate, she felt a surge of empathy. Determined to help, she sought out a local historian, hoping to uncover more about the building's past. Together, they discovered that Thomas had once been accused of something terrible, but had disappeared before the truth could be revealed. The historian believed Thomas had been wrongly accused and that his spirit might be trapped, seeking redemption. With the historian's guidance, Lily performed a small ceremony in the hallway, lighting a candle and speaking aloud, offering peace and forgiveness to the lost soul. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadow flickered and began to fade, dissolving into the dim light of the hallway. From that night on, the shadow never returned. The hallway felt lighter, less oppressive. Lily, too, felt a sense of closure, knowing she had helped bring peace to the tormented spirit of the missing tenant. But every now and then, when she walked the halls late at night, she couldn't help but glance at the far end. half expecting to see the shadow watching her once again. When David first moved into the old apartment building, he was drawn to its vintage charm. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, it had an air of mystery with its ivy-covered walls, creaky floors, and antique fixtures. It felt like stepping back in time, and he loved the quiet that came with living in an old building with few tenants. But not long after settling in, David began to notice something strange. The building, while peaceful during the day, seemed to come alive at night. It wasn't the typical sounds of neighbors or the rattling pipes you'd expect from an old place. There was something different. The noise came from behind a locked, unmarked door on his floor, just down the hall from his apartment. At first it was subtle, a faint thumping, like someone moving furniture, followed by an eerie creaking sound that made the hair on his neck stand on end. David assumed someone must have moved in without his knowledge. But the door was strange. It had no number, and unlike the others, it was heavily secured with a thick, rusted lock and an iron bar across it, as though someone wanted to make sure no one could enter or escape. Curiosity gnawed at him, but he figured it was probably a storage room or maintenance closet. He tried to brush it off, though the noises persisted. At night, the faint sound of scratching would begin, almost rhythmic, as if something or someone was trying to get out. One evening, after a particularly long day, David was lying in bed, the silence of the night pressing down on him. The scratching started again, but this time, it was followed by something new, a soft, muffled voice. At first he thought it was his imagination, but as the minutes passed, the voice grew louder, more desperate. He sat up, straining to hear, but the words were garbled, indecipherable. Unable to ignore it any longer, David decided to investigate. He slipped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and quietly stepped into the hallway. The corridor was dark, with only a few flickering lights casting shadows across the faded wallpaper. As he approached the door, the noises stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Standing in front of the door, he hesitated. It looked old, much older than the rest of the building, with deep scratches along the wood. There was something unsettling about it, as if the door itself held secrets it didn't want to reveal. He pressed his ear against the wood, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat. The next day, he went to the building's superintendent, Mr. Carson, an older man with a gruff demeanor who had worked in the building for years. David casually brought up the door, asking if it was a storage room or part of the building's maintenance. Mr. Carson's expression darkened. "That room's been locked for a long time," he muttered, not meeting David's eyes. "Nothing for you to worry about." David pressed on, but the more questions he asked, the more evasive the superintendent became. Finally, with a sigh, Mr. Carson said, "It's best to leave that room alone. There's a reason it's locked." Unsatisfied with the vague response, David began digging into the building's history. Late at night, he scoured the internet, searching for anything he could find. The building was nearly 100 years old and had seen its fair share of owners and tenants. But one article from the local archives caught his attention. Decades ago, the building had been the site of a tragedy. A woman named Evelyn had lived on the same floor David now called home. According to the article, she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and no one had seen her again. The last anyone knew, she had been living alone in her apartment, plagued by rumors of strange happenings. The authorities searched her apartment, but found no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. Evelyn had simply vanished. The article mentioned that her apartment had been sealed after her disappearance. The address matched David's building, but what really sent a chill down his spine was that the unmarked room had once been Evelyn's. Determined to uncover the truth, David spoke to some of the older tenants, hoping to learn more. Most of them were tight-lipped, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. But one older woman, Mrs. Thompson, finally opened up. "Evelyn wasn't the first," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "People have disappeared from that room before her, and every time they lock it up hoping to forget, but the building doesn't forget." David's stomach twisted with dread. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "No one knows for sure. Some say she was taken. Others believe she never left." They say you can still hear her at night, scratching, trying to get out. That night, David couldn't sleep. The weight of what he'd learned pressed down on him. The scratching, the whispers, they all made sense now. Evelyn's spirit, or whatever remained of her, was trapped in that room, trying to reach out. Determined to end it, he decided to confront the room one last time. He knew it was reckless, but he couldn't live with the knowledge that something, or someone, was trapped behind that door. Armed with a crowbar and his flashlight, he made his way to the hallway in the dead of night. His hands trembled as he forced the crowbar beneath the iron bar securing the door. It creaked loudly as he pried it open, echoing through the silent hall. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was small, dark, and covered in dust. The air inside was thick and musty, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. But it wasn't empty. In the far corner, barely visible in the faint light of his flashlight, was an old wooden chair, and slumped in it was the figure of a woman. David's heart nearly stopped. The figure was skeletal, draped in tattered clothes, her hollow eyes staring straight ahead. It was Evelyn, or what was left of her. Her hands were worn, the fingernails broken and bloodied from years of scratching at the walls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The temperature in the room plummeted, and David's breath came in ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the whispers started again, louder this time, echoing all around him. Panicking, David scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew more frantic, as though Evelyn, or whatever was left of her, was desperate to tell him something. Just as he thought he would suffocate under the weight of the room, the door flew open. Mr. Carson stood there, his face pale, his hands shaking. Without a word, he pulled David out, slamming the door shut behind them. "I told you to leave it alone," Mr. Carson said, his voice thick with fear. David didn't argue. He never spoke of the room again, and neither did anyone else. The noises continued, but David ignored them, knowing the dark secret that lay behind the locked door, a secret that would remain buried, just like Evelyn. For the rest of his lease, David would pass the door in silence, never daring to look or linger. Some things, he realized, were better left locked away. When the Ramirez family moved into apartment 13, they thought they had finally caught a lucky break. The rent was surprisingly affordable for such a spacious unit in the heart of the city. Maria, her husband Carlos, and their 9-year-old daughter Sophia were eager to make the place their own. The apartment was old, sure, with its creaky hardwood floors and faded wallpaper, but it had character, and Maria immediately envisioned the life they could build within its walls. However, from the first day they moved in, there was something unsettling about the place. It wasn't anything they could put their finger on, just an odd feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. They attributed it to nerves from the move, exhaustion from unpacking, and the general unfamiliarity of a new home. But it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. At first, it was small. Maria would wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint footsteps in the hallway, even though Sophia and Carlos were fast asleep. She'd rise from bed to investigate, only to find the corridor empty and silent, the sound of her own breathing the only thing breaking the stillness. Then Sophia started complaining about her toys being moved. "Mom, I left my doll on the chair, but now it's under the bed," she said one morning. Maria brushed it off, thinking Sophia must have been mistaken. Kids were often careless with their things, after all. But then Carlos, a practical man who didn't believe in the supernatural, noticed that objects in the apartment weren't where they had left them. His keys would disappear, only to be found in odd places like inside a kitchen cabinet or on the windowsill of the living room. The real trouble started about a month after they moved in. One evening, Maria found Sophia standing in the hallway, staring at the door to the small linen closet near the front door. When Maria asked her what she was doing, Sophia didn't turn around. She simply whispered, "She's in there." Maria's skin prickled. "Who's in there, sweetie?" "The lady. She's always there, watching." Maria's heart raced, and she slowly approached the closet. There was nothing strange about it, just shelves filled with towels and spare sheets. But Sophia insisted, her young voice laced with fear. "She's in there, Mom. She doesn't want us here." Maria told herself It was just her daughter's overactive imagination, but the incident left her shaken. That night, as she lay in bed next to Carlos, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her eyes frequently darting toward the bedroom door. Sleep came fitfully. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Lights flickered at odd intervals, and strange cold spots appeared throughout the apartment, even when the windows were shut. Maria began hearing faint whispers, though she could never make out what they were saying. Doors opened and closed by themselves, and the footsteps in the hallway became a nightly occurrence. One evening, after putting Sofia to bed, Maria sat down with Carlos at the dining table. "I think something is wrong with this apartment," she admitted, her voice low. "I don't know if it's the wiring or the plumbing or something else, but things keep happening. Have you noticed?" Carlos, who had always been skeptical of anything supernatural, nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I've noticed. But it's an old building. Old places have their quirks. We just need to settle in." But Maria wasn't convinced. Something felt deeply wrong. The breaking point came one night when they were all asleep. Maria was jolted awake by a loud crash from the kitchen. Her first thought was that someone had broken in. She grabbed Carlos and they rushed into the kitchen, where they found all the cabinet doors wide open, pots and pans scattered across the floor. Sofia came running out of her room, eyes wide with fear. "Mom! Dad! She's mad! She's really mad!" Maria's heart dropped into her stomach. "Who's mad, baby?" Sofia's eyes were brimming with tears. "The lady, the one who was here before us." Maria and Carlos exchanged a look. They couldn't keep brushing this off as coincidence. Something was wrong, and they needed answers. The next morning, Maria went to the building's superintendent, an elderly man named Mr. Delaney, who had lived there for decades. When she asked him about the previous tenants of apartment 13, his face paled. "You don't want to go digging into that," he muttered. Maria pressed him. "Please, we're scared. My daughter is scared. Something is happening in that apartment." Mr. Delaney sighed and reluctantly told her the story. The last tenant, her name was Evelyn Harper. She lived there for years, but she kept to herself. She didn't have any family. One day, she just disappeared. No one ever saw her leave the building, but she wasn't there anymore. The police searched the apartment, but they didn't find anything. After a few months, they declared her missing. Eventually, the apartment was cleared out and put back on the market, but people say she never really left. The hair on Maria's arms stood on end. "What do you mean?" "She didn't disappear," Mr. Delaney said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She died in that apartment. There were rumors that she was into strange things, dark things, the kind of stuff you don't mess with. People say her spirit got trapped there. She's still in apartment 13. Maria left the conversation shaken to her core. She had heard enough. When she told Carlos what she'd learned, even his skepticism began to falter. That night, they packed their bags and decided to leave the apartment the next morning. But the apartment wasn't done with them yet. That night, the strange occurrences escalated. The temperature dropped so low that their breath fogged in the air, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then, as they were gathering their things, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Sofia screamed from her bedroom. Maria and Carlos rushed in to find her standing in the middle of the room, staring at the window. "She's here," Sofia whispered, pointing toward the shadows in the corner. In the faint moonlight, Maria saw it, an outline, a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, watching them. She felt a cold, suffocating presence wash over her, freezing her in place. The figure didn't move, but the air felt thick with anger, as if it wanted to drive them out, or worse, keep them there forever. With every ounce of strength, Maria grabbed Sofia, and Carlos led them both out of the apartment. They didn't stop running until they were outside the building, breathless and terrified. The next day, they broke their lease. They didn't care about losing the deposit or the hassle of finding a new place. Apartment 13 had its own tenant, one who had never really left. As they drove away, Sofia looked out the window and whispered, "Goodbye, lady." The shadow had let them leave, but Maria knew they had narrowly escaped whatever dark fate had claimed Evelyn Harper. Some doors, once opened, are better left closed. And some apartments, no matter how affordable, come with too high a price. Lena Park was excited when she signed the lease for her new apartment. The building was charming, located in a quiet neighborhood, and best of all, it was affordable, a rare find in the bustling city. The third-floor unit had a large window that overlooked the street, hardwood floors, and even a small balcony. It was perfect for her, a quiet, hard-working woman looking for peace and a fresh start. Her move went smoothly, and she spent the first few days unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling in. The neighbors seemed polite enough, nodding in the hallways but keeping to themselves. The building had an air of calm, and that suited Lena just fine. It wasn't until her first night in the apartment that things started to feel a little off. As she lay in bed, drifting off to sleep, she heard the faint sounds of footsteps next door. At first, she thought nothing of it. It was an old building, after all, and the walls were thin. She could hear the distant hum of city traffic, the occasional creak of the floorboards above her, and now the sounds of her neighbor moving about. The footsteps were light, steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Lena assumed her neighbor was just a night owl and would eventually settle down. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued for hours, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. There was also the distinct sound of furniture being dragged across the floor, the scrape loud and jarring in the quiet night. By 3 a.m., Lena was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, frustrated and exhausted. She was too shy to knock on the door and complain, so she put in earplugs and hoped the noise would die down soon. The next morning, over a cup of coffee, Lena thought about what she'd heard. She decided it must have been a one-time thing. Maybe her neighbor was reorganizing their furniture late at night, or perhaps they were dealing with insomnia and pacing helped them think. Everyone had their quirks. She pushed the thought aside and went about her day. But the following night, the noises returned. The same light footsteps, the same dragging sounds. This time, there were occasional bangs, as if something heavy was being dropped onto the floor. Lena sat up in bed, her heart racing as the noise grew louder. It was unnerving to hear such activity next door, especially at such a late hour. The worst part was that it seemed to stop and start randomly, as though whoever was next door was restless, never satisfied with their arrangement. By the third night, Lena couldn't take it anymore. She resolved to go next door and ask her neighbor to keep it down. It wasn't an unreasonable request, and she figured a polite conversation would resolve the issue. She waited until the noise began again, around midnight, and then threw on her robe, slipped on her slippers, and walked to the door of the adjacent apartment. She knocked lightly at first, not wanting to wake anyone else in the building. No response. She knocked again, louder this time, and pressed her ear to the door. The footsteps continued, as though the person inside hadn't heard her at all. "Hello?" she called, knocking a third time. "Can you please keep it down? It's late." Again, no response. But she could clearly hear the pacing inside, the same steady back-and-forth movement. After several more knocks with no answer, Lena returned to her apartment, frustrated and unnerved. Who paces around all night without acknowledging their neighbor? The next morning, she ran into Mrs. Ellis, the elderly woman who lived in the unit across the hall. Mrs. Ellis had lived in the building for over 40 years and knew just about everything that went on. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Ellis said with a kind smile. "Morning," Lena replied, but her mind was still on the events of the night before. She hesitated before speaking again. "Hey, do you know who lives next door to me? I've been hearing a lot of noise coming from their apartment late at night, and they never answer the door when I knock." Mrs. Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Next door? There's no one living in that apartment, dear. It's been vacant for years." Lena froze. "Vacant? But I've been hearing someone in there every night since I moved in." The older woman frowned and shook her head. "That can't be. The last tenant moved out a long time ago. Years, I'd say. I don't think anyone's even been in there since. Management keeps it locked up because they're supposed to be renovating it, but that's been on hold for ages." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "But I swear I hear footsteps, furniture moving. There's definitely someone in there." Mrs. Ellis gave her a sympathetic smile, patting her arm gently. "Old buildings make a lot of noise, dear. Creaks and groans, especially at night. You're probably just hearing things." Lena nodded, but her gut told her otherwise. She knew what she heard. That night, the sounds returned, louder than ever. Footsteps, banging, and even what sounded like muffled voices. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she approached the building's maintenance manager, Mr. Harris, the next day. "Are you sure the apartment next to mine is vacant?" she asked. Mr. Harris looked puzzled. "Yeah, it's been empty for a while now. Haven't had the funds to fix it up. Why?" Lena explained the noises, the pacing, the banging in the middle of the night. Mr. Harris's expression grew more concerned with each word. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. "I've got the only key to that apartment. No one should be in there." Against his better judgment, Mr. Harris agreed to check it out. He led Lena to the apartment and unlocked the door. When they stepped inside, the apartment was cold, musty, and empty. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had been there for years. Dust covered every surface, undisturbed. But the strangest thing was the lingering sensation of being watched, as though the empty room was hiding something just out of sight. Lena shivered. "I don't understand. I hear someone in here every night." Mr. Harris scratched his head, clearly uneasy. "Well, I'll make sure to lock it back up, but I'm telling you, no one's been in here." That night, despite the apartment being thoroughly checked and locked up, the noises returned. The footsteps, the dragging, the strange bangs. They were louder than ever, as if whoever, or whatever, was in that apartment wanted to make their presence known. Lena was terrified, unable to sleep, her heart pounding with every thud next door. One evening, desperate for answers, she stayed awake all night, sitting by the wall that separated her from the phantom apartment. She listened closely, hearing the footsteps grow closer and closer to the wall. And then, at around 3 a.m., she heard a faint whisper, a voice, low and indistinct, but unmistakably human. "Help me," it said. Lena's blood ran cold. The next morning, Lena packed her bags and left the apartment. She didn't give notice to the landlord, didn't explain to anyone why she was leaving so suddenly. She just knew she couldn't stay there any longer. Years later, she still wondered what had really happened in apartment 13. Was it the restless spirit of a former tenant, a figment of her imagination, or something else entirely? She never found out, and she didn't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. When Alice first moved into the crumbling, ivy-covered building on the outskirts of town, she thought it had character. The rent was affordable, the location was convenient, and it had the sort of old-world charm that she found irresistible. The building itself was 5 stories tall, with cracked stone walls and wrought iron balconies that creaked with age. It had survived for over 100 years, long enough to have collected stories and secrets of its own. But it was the elevator that truly gave the building its personality. Old, rickety, and slow, it had been installed decades ago when the building had first been modernized. It groaned and clanked with every floor it passed, its metal cage rattling as it rose and fell. It felt like something out of a forgotten era, almost as though it didn't belong in this time. Yet despite its antique charm, the tenants were wary of it. From the very first day, Alice noticed the uneasy glances her neighbors shot at the elevator. Most of them took the stairs, even if they lived on the top floors. At first, she chalked it up to a preference for exercise, or maybe a fear of confined spaces. She didn't think much of it until the second week, when she experienced her first unsettling encounter with the elevator. It was late, well past midnight, and Alice had just returned from a long day at work. She pressed the call button for the elevator, and after a few moments, the familiar sound of its ancient gears grinding echoed through the hallway. The door opened with a loud clank, and she stepped inside, feeling the chill of the old metal walls. As the elevator began its slow ascent to the 3rd floor, Alice noticed something strange. She wasn't alone. In the corner of the small space near the back stood a figure, a woman, her face hidden beneath a veil of long dark hair. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, the kind that might have been worn in the 1920s, and her head was bowed as though she was lost in thought or mourning. Startled, Alice opened her mouth to say something, to greet her, but no words came out. Something about the figure was deeply unsettling. The air in the elevator seemed to thicken, pressing in on Alice's chest, making it hard to breathe. She could hear the faint hum of the elevator's mechanisms, but beyond that, there was an eerie silence, like the world had stopped moving. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, unmoving, her presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. Alice's heart began to race, panic clawing at her throat. She pressed the button for the third floor again, as if it would somehow make the elevator go faster. The elevator seemed to slow, as though the figure's presence was weighing it down. The floor numbers above the door changed agonizingly slowly. 1, 2. Finally, the elevator reached the third floor with a loud creak. The doors slid open, and Alice bolted out, her pulse pounding in her ears. She glanced back over her shoulder, expecting to see the woman stepping out behind her, but the elevator was empty. The strange figure had vanished as silently as she had appeared. Shaken, Alice hurried to her apartment, locking the door behind her. She tried to convince herself that it was a trick of the mind, maybe a shadow or reflection playing tricks in the dim light. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. It was no ordinary reflection. Over the next few days, Alice avoided the elevator. She took the stairs, just like her neighbors, ignoring the creaky call of the old lift. She noticed that others seemed to do the same, their eyes flicking toward the elevator, but their feet carrying them up the stairs instead. No one talked about it, but it was clear that everyone in the building knew something was off about it. One evening, as Alice was coming home, she bumped into Mrs. Kramer, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades. Mrs. Kramer was known for her stories about the building's history, tales of long-gone tenants, and the strange happenings that had occurred over the years. Alice, still haunted by her encounter, decided to ask, "Mrs. Kramer, do you know anything about the elevator? I saw something in there the other night. A woman." Mrs. Kramer's face paled, her usual smile fading into a grim expression. She glanced around, as if to make sure no one else was listening, before speaking in a hushed voice. "You've seen her, haven't you? The woman in the veil." Alice nodded, her throat tight. "Who is she?" Mrs. Kramer sighed heavily, her eyes distant as if recalling a memory long buried. "It happened many years ago, before most of us moved in. The building used to be home to a young couple, Margaret and Henry Davis. They lived on the top floor, in apartment 501. Margaret was beautiful, with dark hair and a quiet demeanor. Everyone adored her, but Henry, he was a troubled man, prone to fits of jealousy and anger. People whispered that he was abusive." Alice listened intently, her heart pounding as Mrs. Kramer continued. "One night, there was a terrible argument between them. Screams echoed through the halls, and then silence. The next morning, Margaret was gone. Henry claimed she had left him, run off in the night, but no one ever saw her again. Days turned into weeks, and then months, but Margaret never returned. Some suspected foul play, but there was never any evidence to prove it." Alice shivered, feeling a cold chill creeping up her spine. "They say her spirit is still here," Mrs. Kramer said softly. "Trapped in the building, waiting for someone to discover the truth of what happened to her. She's been seen in the elevator, always in that old dress, her hair hiding her face. Some people hear her crying, others feel her presence before they see her. But one thing is certain, she only appears to those who are willing to listen, who are willing to help." Alice's mouth went dry. "But what can I do?" Mrs. Kramer shook her head sadly. "I don't know, dear. But if you keep riding that elevator, she'll find a way to tell you." Against her better judgment, Alice started using the elevator again. Each time she entered, she braced herself for another encounter. For several days, nothing happened. The elevator creaked and groaned, as it always did, but it was empty. Then, one evening, as Alice was returning from work, the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. This time, the lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. The familiar chill crept in, and Alice knew she wasn't alone. The woman was there again, standing in the same spot, her head bowed. But this time, when the elevator jolted to a stop between the second and third floors, the woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark, filled with unspeakable sorrow. Her lips parted, and in a whisper so faint it was almost drowned out by the hum of the elevator, she spoke. "Help me." Alice's heart raced. "How? What do you need?" The woman pointed to the control panel. Alice hesitated, unsure of what she meant, but then she noticed something she hadn't before, a small, nearly invisible button beneath the usual ones. It was worn and faded, as if it had been pressed many times before. Without thinking, she pressed it. The elevator shuddered, then descended quickly, but instead of stopping on the third floor, it continued down, past the lobby, past the basement, into what felt like the very depths of the earth. The doors opened to reveal a dark, hidden room. Inside, Alice saw something that made her blood run cold. An old, decaying trunk covered in dust and cobwebs. With trembling hands, she opened the trunk, and there, inside, lay the skeletal remains of a woman, her dark hair still clinging to her skull. It was Margaret Davis. The police were called, and Henry Davis, now an old man, was arrested for the murder of his wife. He had hidden her body in the forgotten basement, sealing her fate and dooming her spirit to wander the building for eternity. After that night, the strange occurrences in the elevator stopped. The old lift still creaked and groaned, but the ghostly woman was gone. Her tragic story finally laid to rest. Alice moved out soon after, unable to shake the memories of what she had uncovered. But she never forgot the woman in the veil and the chilling realization that sometimes the dead are not content to remain forgotten. When Sophia moved into the old brick apartment building, nestled on a quiet street, she was eager for a fresh start. The building had a faded charm, with ivy creeping up the sides and tall, narrow windows that gave the place a Gothic feel. The rent was affordable, and the apartment itself was spacious, filled with light in the daytime, thanks to the large windows that overlooked the bustling city. It seemed like the perfect place to settle down and begin the next chapter of her life. But almost immediately after moving in, something strange happened. On her first morning in the apartment, Sophia found a letter on the floor just inside her front door. The envelope was addressed to someone named Daniel Walker at her apartment number, 4B. Assuming it was a simple mix-up, she took the letter down to the mailbox, intending to leave it for the postman to pick up. She figured it was just a piece of old mail left over from the previous tenant, the kind of mistake that happens all the time. Over the next few days, however, more letters arrived. Each one was addressed to Daniel Walker, and each one bore her apartment number, 4B. The letters began piling up. Bills, postcards, even a birthday card, all addressed to this mysterious person who, according to her lease, had never lived there. Curious and a little unsettled, Sophia decided to ask the landlord about it. Mr. Grayson, an elderly man who had owned the building for decades, was often seen tending to the small garden out front or fixing things in the lobby. "Excuse me, Mr. Grayson," Sophia began one afternoon when she saw him pruning the hedges. "I've been receiving a lot of mail for someone named Daniel Walker. Do you know if he lived in my apartment before me?" The old man looked up, his brow furrowing. He wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head slowly. "No one by that name ever lived in 4B, he said with certainty. "In fact, I don't recall anyone named Daniel Walker ever living in this building at all." Sophia frowned, confused. "But I keep getting his mail, and there's been quite a lot of it." Mr. Grayson gave her a puzzled look. "I don't know what to tell you, miss. According to my records, the last tenant in 4B was a woman, Rebecca Hayes. She lived there for several years before she moved out last month." Sophia thanked him and walked back to her apartment, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. Why would she be receiving mail for someone who had never lived there? And why did it seem like so much mail, as if this person had been expecting to stay for a long time? That night, as Sophia unpacked the last of her boxes, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a delivery driver holding a large package. "Delivery for Daniel Walker," the driver said, checking his clipboard. Sophia blinked, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. "There's no Daniel Walker here. That's my apartment, and I've been receiving his mail. But no one by that name lives here." The driver glanced at the label, then at her, clearly perplexed. "Says right here, 4B Daniel Walker." Sighing, Sophia reluctantly took the package, figuring she'd have to return it or try to find a forwarding address. As she shut the door and set the box down, the unease that had been gnawing at her all day intensified. That night, Sophia barely slept. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. She kept imagining the name Daniel Walker, repeating in her head like a ghostly whisper. Why was she receiving so much mail for a man who supposedly never lived there? What was the story behind him? Over the next few days, the letters kept coming. Each one bore the same name, the same apartment number, and no return address. The package, too, sat unopened in the corner of her living room. For some reason, Sophia couldn't bring herself to open it. It felt wrong, like she would be prying into something deeply personal and unsettling. The whole situation was beginning to feel like a mystery she wasn't supposed to solve, but her curiosity got the better of her. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Sophia sat in her living room, staring at the unopened package. She felt a strange compulsion to open it, as though it were calling to her. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut through the tape. As she opened the flaps, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a framed photo of a man, mid-30s, dark hair, and piercing blue eyes, staring straight at the camera with an expression that could only be described as haunting. Beside the photo was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. Sophia unfolded it, her hands trembling. The note read, "To Daniel Walker, may your spirit find peace at last." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. Who was this man? And why was this package delivered to her apartment, as if it were meant for her? She knew she had to find answers. The next morning, Sophia visited the local library to research the building's history. She combed through old newspapers, hoping to find some mention of Daniel Walker, but there was nothing. No record of him in any census, no news articles, no mention of him at all. It was as if he had never existed. But then, buried in the archives, she found an old newspaper article from nearly 20 years ago. The headline sent a chill down her spine. Unexplained death in apartment 4B. Tenant found dead under mysterious circumstances. The article described the tragic and baffling death of a man named Daniel Walker, who had been found dead in her very apartment. There had been no signs of foul play, but no clear cause of death either. The authorities had ruled it a heart attack, but the details were strange. Neighbors reported hearing loud thuds and strange noises coming from his apartment in the days leading up to his death. And after his passing, those noises had continued, despite the apartment being vacant. Sophia's blood ran cold as she read the final line of the article. Walker's death remains unsolved, and the apartment has been vacant ever since. Her mind raced. How could Mr. Grayson not know about this? How could he claim no one named Daniel Walker had ever lived in the building? Had he deliberately hidden the truth? Or was he simply unaware of the building's dark history? That night, Sophia lay awake, every creak of the old building amplified in the darkness. The unanswered questions gnawed at her. And then, in the stillness of the early hours, she heard it, a faint knock on her door. She sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. The knock came again, more insistent this time. With trembling hands, Sophia made her way to the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing. The hallway was empty, but the knocking persisted, louder now, echoing through the apartment. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling the space with an oppressive sense of dread. She threw the door open, expecting to see, what? A ghost? A man who had died decades ago? But the hallway was empty, silent, save for the distant hum of the elevator. And then, from the shadows near the end of the hall, a figure stepped forward. It was the man from the photograph, Daniel Walker, his piercing blue eyes staring straight at her, his face twisted in a grim expression. He stood there, motionless, as though waiting for her to speak. Sophia's throat went dry, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but his gaze seemed to bore into her, his presence heavy and suffocating. He pointed to the apartment door, as if urging her to let him in. Terrified, Sophia slammed the door shut and bolted it, her heart pounding in her ears. But even after she locked the door, she could still feel him, his presence lingering just beyond the threshold, as though he were watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge him. The mail, the packages, the photograph, it all made sense now. Daniel Walker had never left. His spirit was trapped, caught between life and death, and for some reason, he had chosen her to help him. But Sophia didn't know how to help a ghost. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. She packed a bag that night and left, not bothering to explain to Mr. Grayson why she was leaving so suddenly. As she walked away from the building, she glanced back one last time. In the dim light of the early morning, she thought she saw a figure standing at the window of 4B, watching her leave, Daniel Walker. And as Sophia disappeared down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, the haunting wasn't over. Not for her, not for him, because some tenants, even in death, never truly leave. The Hamilton Arms had always been a quiet apartment building. Located in an older part of town, the brick structure stood like a relic from another era, with ivy creeping up its walls and ornate ironwork decorating its balconies. Most of the tenants were longtime residents, drawn to the building's affordable rent and charmingly old-fashioned architecture. For years, nothing much had changed in Hamilton Arms until the noises started. It began as faint sounds late at night, a low thudding like the creak of heavy footsteps on ancient wooden floors, or the faint clank of pipes shifting in the walls. The residents chalked it up to the building's age, dismissing the occasional groan and rumble as the workings of the old heating system. But soon, the noises grew louder, more distinct. Scratching sounds, muffled voices, and what sounded like something dragging across the floor. Sophia, who had lived in the building for almost 2 years, was the first to grow concerned. Her apartment was on the ground floor, and her bedroom window overlooked the building's side alley. For weeks, she had been waking up at odd hours to the sounds of heavy footsteps echoing from somewhere below her apartment. At first, she assumed it was the building's superintendent, Mr. Calloway, working late in the basement. But the noises persisted long after Mr. Calloway had left for the night. One night, Sophia couldn't sleep. The noises were louder than ever, thuds, scrapes, and something that sounded like soft, distant murmuring. Her curiosity piqued. She decided to investigate. Slipping on a pair of slippers and grabbing a flashlight, she made her way to the basement door at the end of the hallway. The basement had always been off-limits to tenants. Mr. Calloway had made it clear that only he and maintenance staff were allowed down there, as the space was filled with old machinery and pipes. But tonight, something about the noises called to her, almost daring her to go down. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on the doorknob, listening intently. From below, she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps shuffling slowly across the basement floor. Taking a deep breath, Sophia pushed open the door and descended the narrow staircase. The basement was dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. The air was cool and damp, with a faint smell of mildew and rust. As her feet touched the cold cement floor, the noises abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost oppressive. Sophia swept her flashlight across the basement, its beam cutting through the darkness. Old boxes and rusted pipes lined the walls, and in the far corner, a pile of discarded furniture lay covered in dust. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, as she moved further into the room, she saw it. A door, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was an old metal door, its surface marred with rust and deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Sophia had never noticed the door before, and something about it sent a chill down her spine. As she approached, she heard it again, the soft murmur of a voice, barely audible, coming from behind the door. Her heart raced, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to know what was behind it. Slowly, she reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow, pitch-black hallway. The smell of damp earth and something foul wafted out, making her gag. Sophia's flashlight flickered, but she pressed on, stepping into the corridor. The moment she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped and the air grew heavy. The walls of the hallway were old, lined with crumbling brick and dirt. It felt wrong, like this part of the building didn't belong to the Hamilton Arms at all. As she moved deeper into the hallway, the sounds grew louder, whispers, shuffling footsteps, and the occasional low growl that set every nerve in her body on edge. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, Sophia thought she saw something move at the far end of the corridor, something hunched and shadowy, retreating into the darkness. Her pulse quickened, but she couldn't stop now. She had to see what was down here. The hallway ended at another door, this one wooden and much older than the rest of the building. It looked like it had been there for centuries, its surface weathered and covered in deep gouges. Sophia hesitated for a moment, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Whatever was behind this door, it was no ordinary basement dweller. Steeling herself, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like old, dried blood. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and in the center of the room was a figure, hunched, emaciated, and wrapped in tattered cloth. Its back was to her, but as she stepped inside, the figure shifted slightly, as if sensing her presence. Sophia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure's breathing was slow and labored, each inhale rattling like a dying gasp. For a moment, neither of them moved, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure turned to face her. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its skin was stretched tight over its bones, gray and rotting. But what terrified Sophia the most was the thing's mouth, twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, with teeth too long and sharp for any human. Before she could react, the creature let out a low, guttural growl and lunged at her, its bony fingers clawing the air as it moved. Sophia stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she turned and ran. The creature's raspy breaths and shuffling steps echoed behind her, growing closer with each passing second. She bolted down the narrow hallway, her heart hammering in her chest, the door to the basement growing larger in her vision. She slammed the door behind her, bolting it shut just as the creature's claws scraped against the other side. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the creature let out a frustrated howl that sent a chill down her spine. Sophia backed away, her mind racing. What had she just seen? And why had no one ever mentioned this before? The building's basement, no, Hamilton Arms itself, was hiding a dark secret. Something or someone was living down there, something that shouldn't exist. Over the next few days, Sophia tried to go about her life as if nothing had happened, but the fear gnawed at her. Every time she passed the basement door, she felt that same oppressive presence, like something was watching her, waiting for her to return. The noises continued, growing louder, more insistent, and soon the other tenants began to notice as well. One by one, the residents of Hamilton Arms started reporting strange occurrences, missing items, eerie whispers in the night, and most unsettling of all, the feeling that someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. But when Sophia tried to warn them, they brushed it off, unwilling to believe the truth. It wasn't until one of the tenants went missing, an elderly man who lived on the first floor, that the rest of the building began to take the noises seriously. The police were called, but they found no trace of the missing man. The only clue was his apartment door, left wide open, with deep claw-like scratches gouged into the floor leading toward the basement. Sophia knew then that whatever was living down there wasn't human. It had been there for years, hidden away, feeding on the building's secrets and waiting for the right moment to strike. And now it was hungry. It was raining the day Michael moved into the old apartment on the third floor of Holloway Court. The building had seen better days. Its brick facade was chipped, ivy tangled in the crevices, and the windows were clouded from years of neglect. But the rent was cheap, and the landlord, Mr. Graves, had assured him that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, leaving behind most of their belongings. He was welcome to keep anything he found. The apartment itself was modest but had a certain charm: hardwood floors, tall windows, and a creaky door that led to a small balcony overlooking the alley. There was something melancholic about it, though, an air of abandonment, as if the place was holding on to memories that no longer belonged. Michael liked that. It felt quiet, a good place to escape. As he unpacked, he noticed the mirror. It was leaning against the far wall, still covered by a dusty, moth-eaten cloth. It was a large, ornate mirror, the kind that wouldn't look out of place in an old manor. The frame was intricately carved with swirling designs, vines and flowers, intertwining with strange, twisted shapes that almost looked like faces if you glanced at them from the corner of your eye. Michael hadn't noticed it during the walkthrough, but the moment he saw it, he was captivated. He pulled the cloth away, revealing the full length of the mirror. The glass was slightly fogged with age, and the reflection it gave back was dull, almost as if it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Strange that someone would leave something like this behind, he thought. At first, Michael didn't pay much attention to the mirror. It was just an old piece of furniture after all. But over the next few days, he began to notice something odd about it. Every time he glanced at his reflection, he got the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from the other side. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It felt like eyes were following him, staring at him from deep within the glass, just out of sight. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, he caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. He froze, staring at the reflection, but everything seemed normal. He was alone in the room, the bed behind him unmade, the dim light casting soft shadows across the walls. But just as he was about to turn away, he saw it again, a shadow flickering in the glass, something shifting in the darkness beyond the reflection. His heart skipped a beat. He approached the mirror slowly, his breath shallow, eyes scanning the surface for any sign of what he had seen. There was nothing there, just his own pale face staring back at him, slightly distorted by the old glass. Michael shook his head, laughing nervously. "Just my imagination," he muttered to himself, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. He would see brief flashes of movement in the mirror, strange figures lurking just behind his reflection. Sometimes, when he looked closely, the room behind him didn't quite match the real world. Objects seemed slightly out of place, or the light didn't fall the way it should. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, a constant creeping sensation that never left him, especially when he was near the mirror. One night, after an especially long day at work, Michael sat in front of the mirror, exhausted. He stared into it, trying to convince himself that it was just an old, dusty piece of furniture. But as he watched, the surface of the glass began to ripple, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. He leaned in, his eyes widening. The rippling stopped, and for a moment the mirror seemed normal. But then something horrifying happened. His reflection didn't move. He blinked, but the image in the glass stayed perfectly still, staring back at him with wide, lifeless eyes. He stepped back, his heart racing, but the reflection remained frozen, still sitting in the chair, still staring. And then slowly, impossibly, the reflection began to smile. It was a grotesque, twisted smile, far too wide, as if the face in the mirror was stretching, distorting into something not quite human. Michael stumbled back, knocking over a lamp as he backed away from the mirror. The reflection stood up now, still smiling, its eyes locked on him. And then, in a movement that sent a shiver of cold terror down his spine, the reflection raised a hand and waved. Michael bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the door, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. It couldn't be real, it couldn't be. But the image of that twisted smile, of the thing in the mirror waving at him, was burned into his mind. The next morning, Michael called the landlord. "Mr. Graves," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you know anything about the previous tenant, the one who left in such a hurry?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" Graves replied, his voice cautious. "There's something strange about the apartment," Michael said, "about the things they left behind, especially the mirror." Graves sighed. "Look, I didn't want to spook you, but since you're asking, yes, the previous tenant left in a hurry. She was obsessed with that mirror. Said she kept seeing things in it. Weird things." Michael's skin prickled. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared," Graves admitted. "Vanished without a trace. Police couldn't find anything. It's like she just walked out of her apartment one day and never came back." Michael's blood ran cold. "You think the mirror had something to do with it?" "I don't know," Graves said, "but you're not the first tenant to complain about that thing. If I were you, I'd get rid of it." That night, Michael resolved to do just that. He wasn't staying another night with that cursed mirror in his apartment. He grabbed a sheet and threw it over the mirror, refusing to even glance at his reflection as he did. Then he called a friend with a truck to help him haul it out in the morning. But that night, as he lay in bed, something strange happened. He heard a faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" Graves replied, his voice cautious. "There's something strange about the apartment," Michael said. "About the things they left behind, especially the mirror." Graves sighed. "Look, I didn't want to spook you, but since you're asking, yes, the previous tenant left in a hurry. She was obsessed with that mirror. Said she kept seeing things in it. Weird things." Michael's skin prickled. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared," Graves admitted. "Vanished without a trace. Police couldn't find anything. It's like she just walked out of her apartment one day and never came back." Michael's blood ran cold. "You think the mirror had something to do with it?" "I don't know," Graves said, "but you're not the first tenant to complain about that thing. If I were you, I'd get rid of it." That night, Michael resolved to do just that. He wasn't staying another night with that cursed mirror in his apartment. He grabbed a sheet and threw it over the mirror, refusing to even glance at his reflection as he did. Then he called a friend with a truck to help him haul it out in the morning. But that night, as he lay in bed, something strange happened. He heard a faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound. At first he thought it was just the rain against the window, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the other side of the room, the side where the mirror was. He pulled the covers over his head, willing the noise to stop, but it only grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. With a sinking feeling, Michael realized that the noise was coming from inside the mirror. He could picture it in his mind. The thing from the night before, tapping its fingers against the glass, waiting for him to come closer. He didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, he threw on some clothes and ran to the living room. The sheet over the mirror had been pulled off, lying crumpled on the floor. The mirror stood there, uncovered, its surface dark and still. His friend arrived with the truck, and together they loaded the mirror into the back. As they drove to the dump, Michael kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something watching him from the back of the truck. They arrived at the dump and tossed the mirror into a pile of discarded furniture and trash. As the mirror hit the ground, it shattered, the glass breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces. For a moment, Michael felt relieved. It was over. But as he stared at the broken shards scattered across the ground, he saw something that made his heart stop. In each shard, his reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. The figure in the shards smiled that same twisted, too-wide grin and waved. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.